This is House Planning Help, episode 367. Hello, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you're interested in self-build or retrofit. I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century and trying to break down the major roadblocks that may get in our way. Coming up in this session, my guest is self-builder Lucinda Leech, and we're going to find out how she's been incredibly engaged in her projects. You could almost say it's a labour of love, but she does also bring some practical skills to the table, so you're always going to get involved as a furniture maker. This is one that you might have seen on Grand Designs. We haven't featured a massive amount of projects that have been on Grand Designs, but we like this one and we think it's quite sustainable as well. A lot of the decisions being made, treading very lightly on the area where this house is going to be built. So we'll dig into all the details in a few moments. But first on House Planning Help, we're off to Ambridge. That's making me all nostalgic. When I heard that theme tune as a kid, that meant supper time was ready and my mum had finished listening to the Archers. Why am I playing that? Well, with good reason, because it's the return of a part-time feature here on House Planning Help. This is one that we do when low energy, sustainable buildings break into the mainstream, either in a significant or entertaining way. And get a load of this.
Have you ever heard of the passive house concept?
What, sorry?
The passive house concept.
I'm not sure.
It's a house that's designed to be incredibly energy efficient.
Right.
Basically, these houses make use of the sun, internal heat sources and heat recovery. It can be a building that already exists, which is retrofitted accordingly, or a brand new building altogether.
Sorry, Tony?
Yeah.
Why are you talking about this?
Oh, it's just... Well, I've been daydreaming about building one on Bridge Farm land.
So we could have a fictional passive house in Ambridge. I like it. Good work, writers. Let's get going. Yeah, Tony, if you want a podcast that's going to get you up to speed on how you need to be doing this passive house, well, stick around because I'm just about to chat to Lucinda Leech. So we're off to Herefordshire. And she's got some handy skills actually up her sleeve. I asked her to explain a little bit about her background.
So I've always been a woodworker. I had a furniture making business for many years. As I was trained as a cabinet maker, so wood seemed a natural material to build with.
And when did you come up with the idea of wanting to build your own house?
I think I've always wanted to build my own house, but I've done various restorations and renovations, and just the idea of building from scratch was exciting. You have far more challenges in terms of what you're going to do because it's such a blank canvas, but on the other hand, not having the constraints of an existing building is great.
And when did the opportunity present itself?
I always thought that this would be a great place to put another house. The garden's bigger than an acre, so there's plenty of space, but I never thought I'd get permission. And then I happened to get planning permission unexpectedly some years ago, and then it took sort of 2 or 3 years to work through how to do it before we actually started. And I've been building now for nearly 4 years, which is a long time, but that's on purpose. Sort of on purpose.
A labour of love. Yeah. Maybe you could just describe the site then, including your existing dwelling and where you propose to put the new dwelling.
The site's just over an acre and it's sloping with quite a lot of trees on it. Luckily, the existing house is right over in one corner, so that left a certain amount of scope to fit the new house in without them being on top of each other. So I looked with the architect at various ways of where to put it and how to put it in terms of access and so forth. And we thought the further up the slope, the better, because then we'd get more light and more views and so forth.
And what did you want from this new house?
It was always my plan to retire into it, so I wanted something that was, easy to look after, small. I just wanted to build something big enough for myself and the occasional visitors, and I wanted it to be an eco build. I wanted it to be primarily wood, modest, but beautiful.
You talked about architect already. So was that actually quite an easy one to sort out?
Yeah, we're just a few fields away from Archetype, who are fantastic practice, who do almost entirely passive house. They don't usually do domestic dwellings, but I was lucky that they, as you know, we're neighbours, that Ellie Deacon-Smith was appointed to be my architect, and she now has her own practice. I just really enjoyed working with her. It was such fun going to and fro with ideas and bouncing ideas off and developing how to make it work.
And you're someone who's very practical. Before we hit record here, you were coming out of your workshop. So how do you go about making it so that it's a project that you can get really hands-on?
I guess it's partly about choosing the team to work with. I didn't want to work with a builder who was just going to take the whole thing off my hands, and I visited once a month. The company that I used were remarkably long-suffering with the amount that I stood around and interfered. Then handed it over to me once the shell was up anyway. Obviously, I've had plumbers and electricians, but I've been project managing throughout anyway. And I think even when it's not something I'm going to do myself, it is very helpful to understand how the plumbing and how the wiring works. So you can then make for an efficient construction. What you're asking the other people to do makes sense and is logical, and then they feed back at the same time and say, have you thought of doing this or have you thought of doing that? And then through iteration, you get the most efficient or the best solution to the problems.
And how did you settle upon how much space you'd need and how you're going to work with the budget? What was going to be apportioned to various different things? And
I wrote a very detailed brief before we started, well, what I consider to be a fairly detailed brief, broken down into those different kinds of sections, what sort of space, what sort of budget, what it wanted to look like, what it wanted to feel like. And I think trying to clarify all those things before you begin is really useful. Budget-wise, initially, I was just doing a rough how many pounds per square metre and looking at cost of other people's builds and pitching where I wanted to be within that. However, I was not fortunate in my timing in that the timber prices pretty much doubled over the first year of the build. So that made a huge difference and required me to make some modifications. For example, with the shingles, I just assumed I would order the standard Canadian tapered shingle, which at the time were about £60-65 a bundle, and I needed 120 bundles or something. And by the time I actually came to order them, it had gone up to £155 a bundle, so nearly tripled. And then I thought, well, I can't manage that within the budget. And I ended up then using UK grown, in fact, grown a few miles from here, processed in Shropshire and brought back again, which actually fitted with the ethos of a build much better. And I hadn't even thought of doing it that way. They're not quite as long-lasting, but it looks really good. It looks different to what I'd expected, slightly different, but it's worked.
Because you have this connection with timber, and I think that's worth mentioning some of the even early work that you did in Oxford. So maybe you could tell us about FSC, how your interaction almost as that came about.
Yes. I mean, when I've been going a very long time, and in the early days it wasn't even spoken about, and then sustainability became obviously more and more of an issue, and particularly with regard to timber. And I did a lot of research on that, a lot of travelling. Originally, the focus was largely on tropical timber, and the concerns were around rainforests. Obviously, that's now expanded and people realise that all timber needs looking after. But yeah, in the early days, it was a lot to do with tropical timber. So there was a lot of people saying, well, you must boycott, the mahogany is murder campaign, boycott tropical timber. But the effect of that is to make tropical timber worthless, so the people who live in the places where it grows regard it as something to be got rid of as fast as possible so that they can grow cocoa or coffee or something to make money out of. It sort of backfired as a message, because boycotting the timber made the situation worse, not better. So the approach that myself and a number of friends were taking was that if we could work with individual communities rather than logging companies and buy timber from them, at a value that was closer to the amount that we were paying for the final product, but cut out all the middlemen, then they would have a reason to look after the forest, to treat it as a harvesting operation where they had to look after the forest in order to have the harvest in the future. So taking out a few trees from a big area rather than clear felling the lot.
I've always wondered why that doesn't happen, even with the big loggers. Why would you not do that? Because presumably it can recover a bit more easily.
I guess there's so much forest, or has in the past been so much forest, that it wasn't in the interests of the big companies. It's quite difficult to take out individual trees. It's much easier to whack a road through the middle and bring in big machinery. I think that would probably be the main reason. But the other thing is that tropical forests are much more varied. So in the UK, I think we've got 28 native species. Well, when we were working in Ecuador and we did an inventory on less than a hectare, there was 136 species in that 1 hectare, and then we did in a different village a different inventory and found another 130 species, but only about 20 of those species crossed over. So you've then got to extract the timber from the forest in roughly the same ratio. It doesn't work to go and take out every mahogany and leave stuff that nobody's ever heard of, because then you deplete the mahogany and you therefore alter the balance and so forth. So I think certainly my role was to try and find out what people used the individual timbers for, to give some indication as to what use they'd be in the UK. And that was really interesting to see what people used them for locally. And that project led to a lot of people thinking about sustainable timber, and then they sat around our kitchen table and thought about what to do about it, and that eventually became the FSC. But the actual projects we were working on were too idealistic. I mean, I say we, group of a dozen people from different countries. And it was very idealistic. We were a bunch of hippies.
I think it always starts there, though, doesn't it?
Yes, I mean, I like to think that even though those projects are not, I think, still functioning, it became the basis for something that at the time was very left field and is now mainstream, and people know what the FSC is, they know what sustainable timber is. It's something that is specified by most people who are specifying timber these days. So I think in the long term, it was worth it.
If we fast forward to your project here, how do you know it's sustainable timber? Is it the FSC?
It is largely, yes.
Right.
I mean, there's FSC, there's PEFC, and there's other certification systems. So I would definitely use those. Although there's also they tend to be for the larger scale operations, something like the tin merchant who cut my shingles for me. I can go and visit him, see what he does. He can tell me where he cut the timber, who owned it, what they're doing about it. So again, you can actually ask questions yourself if there isn't certification in place.
That's interesting. So have you ever traced back any of the timber that you've used on this project?
Yeah, I know where the shingles grew with an estate not that far away.
That's also nice.
That's really nice as well, yes. Yeah. Yes, and some of the other timbers in the building as well. Not the I-beam structure, that came from Germany. But
So tell me a little bit about the design process of the house and how it all came together, that you were locking in, this is what I'm going to build.
That's a lot of fun, that process, actually, because
Definitely.
narrowing down your ideas and what you want and how it should look and so forth. So there was a lot of time spent at that stage, just because it was such an enjoyable process. I was using Passive House principles. I don't think it's going to get certified for 2 or 3 reasons to do with the construction and the orientation and the slope of the land, and being able to meet those requirements on overheating and adding heat. But we'll be very close, and the whole PHPP process was enormously useful at the design stage. So that fixed the orientation, the amount of glazing, the details of the structure to get sufficient insulation and so forth.
This might be a good point to mention your son and daughter, who were heavily involved in this process, but your son actually learnt PHPP, didn't he?
He did, yes, in order to be able to not only predict the energy performance of the building, but also to make changes to improve that. So we were able to run it through a number of times, and if any changes came up in the course of construction, we could then feed that back into the package and work out what the results were and whether we needed to adjust the structure in any way. So that was really very useful indeed.
And how did you find the builders? We talked about architects, but
I was lucky to have a really lovely team of builders who were very engaged with the process. Although they hadn't built Passive House before, they were really keen to learn, and they developed the design from basically the pictures that were drawn for planning into something that actually could be built really efficiently and in quite an interesting way.
Am I right in saying that some of this was manufactured off-site?
Yes, it's a mixture. Because of the constraints of the site in terms of access, I didn't want big machinery up there. I'm not having a crane because of the amount of trees. It would damage the tree roots if we had big machinery up there. There isn't actually vehicle access to the house. The last 20 metres, 25 metres are ultimately a footpath. So they were able to build some panels off-site and then transport those onto where it's meant to be. And then the roof, for example, was cut. All the components were cut off-site but assembled on-site.
And we're probably jumping a couple of steps here. So how was it all prepared then? Because again, back to your son helped you out a little bit with being an engineer. I'm not sure we've actually said that, so we probably should say that in terms of your foundations.
Yes, so the foundations are, rather than having to excavate and then put a concrete slab down, we just rolled out this fabric that's called concrete canvas. It's an impregnated fabric, impregnated with cement, which is about 8 mil thick, and you roll it out like carpet and spray it, and it sets hard. And that's pretty much instead of a site cover. And then the building is suspended above that. There's very little concrete in the building, about 3.5 cubic metres altogether, and that we've created some columns. We built shuttering, octagonal, only octagonal because it's the easiest thing to build with a bit of shuttering ply. And those columns are different depths according to what we found when we dug the holes. They're reinforced, and then there's 2 steels, and then after that everything is timber. And between about 200 mil and about 800 mil off the ground, because the sub-level follows the slope.
And then you're using the same way of insulating round the whole building. It's pretty much just joists.
Yeah, it's portal frames, which basically means you've got a series of individual frames that are completely full circle, as it were, fixed together with plywood gussets. And then those just stand up and are connected by the racking board, which is just the OSB on the outside and the smart ply on the inside.
So that's giving you your airtightness layer.
On the inside, the smart ply gives it a continuous airtightness layer, which makes for a very simple structure. Lots of tape, but relatively straightforward way of creating the airtightness, rigid, so rather than a loose membrane which can get damaged. And then the structure for the internal walls, not that there's very much that connects to the outside walls, but where it does, that's all on the inside of the airtightness layer, so it's continuous behind there. And because of the portal frames, the whole thing exists without any internal ties, so you've got the whole of the inside space to play with.
Was there a time when the builders are on site when actually you're making quite a lot of progress? Because I mean, you got the shell put up, and then it was pretty much over to you.
Yes. I mean, the builders came and went a bit more than they might have done, but that's fair enough. I was also, holding things up by not taking the right decisions instantly and all that sort of thing. So on the whole,
like what? What sort of things?
I suppose we did make 1 or 2 alterations from the original. For example, the size of the mezzanine inside. When they started to lay it out, I realised that I wanted the double height space at the sides to be a bit wider, and then that had to be, modifications. And they were very good about changing things like that as we went. You should never change things as you go along, but we did, or I did, I should say, and they were very long-suffering about it.
Well, sometimes there's a ripple effect. It depends what you're changing a little.
Yes, I have to say, when I changed the double height space at the sides, it didn't occur to me that it therefore threw the staircase off. And then I've had to change. Basically, the staircase was fairly carefully designed to fit in that space because it's now 200 mil wider. The staircase has to shift 200 mil over, which has created a useful space for bookcases. So
when the builders finished, what did they leave you with?
an airtight structure as far as the internal is concerned and battened externally, so ready for the shingles and the cladding on the outside. But then they came back to help with the cladding because the pieces were so long I couldn't manage to do them by myself.
In terms of that fit out that's happening internally, so was this a financial thing that you decided to put on the brakes and do more yourself, or how are you balancing all this up?
I mean, I'd sort of envisaged doing the shingles myself. I hadn't envisaged there being 10,500 of them. The roof, I couldn't do the roof. We didn't have scaffold for the roof because of the cost. And so I was extremely fortunate that my cousin's son, who's not only an architect but also a rock climber, happened to have a month spare. And he rigged ropes and dangled off a harness for a month, putting the shingles on that I could reach from the scaffolding the first 7 rows. But there's about 25 rows. And so he did all the upper rows, which was very fortunate. And the finances have, clearly the budget has been stretched a lot in various places, and that does mean that you do more yourself.
And we know that the cost of materials, that was one of the big ones.
It's primarily the cost of materials, and then the drainage system cost a lot more than I was expecting. Access a bit more, sort of bits and pieces along the way, but...
Okay, let's talk about some of these. So access, how is that a cost?
So it was necessary to put in a new driveway to the new house. And there's a whole saga that hasn't been told here because there was a burst water main which came down the drive, and half the drive then started to fall into the stream. So the driveway into the building was impassable, and that slowed things down. But it's a whole nother story.
That was from construction, though, that it got damaged.
It wasn't our fault. No, absolutely. Goodness. It was totally coincidental. Right. The water main burst in the lane. It poured down the driveway, which cracked the bank between the driveway and the stream. So the driveway started to fall into the stream, and therefore we could just about squeeze a car past, but we couldn't get any mix. This is in the very early days before the foundations were in. We couldn't get the mixers in or anything. So that's quite a long saga that possibly we don't want to embark on.
You said drainage as well being another quite big cost.
So we had to have a bespoke drainage system designed because there's a stream at the bottom of the slope which feeds into the Wye, which has major problems with phosphates. So the environmental officer connected with the planning has a very close involvement with how you're going to process. There's no mains drainage here or mains water. There is mains water in the lane. We've had that now brought up to the house, but there's no mains drainage. So I had to have a bespoke system for processing that. And the soil is a very heavy clay, so when we did our percolation tests, it was clear that we didn't have the permeability required for the water to soak away in the normal way, so I had to have something different designed.
Maybe you could just describe the timeline a bit so that we get an idea of this time and what is going on. So a few key points.
We were just about to start. We were in the builder's office finalising the details when they announced the COVID close down. So that then delayed the start for some time. It did, however, mean that my son and daughter both came back home to work from home for various reasons during that. So I had some extra free labour, and a number of their local friends also came home, and of course they weren't allowed to meet their friends socially at that time, but if I employed them all to work on the building site, they could all spend the day moving concrete or digging or
as many volunteers as possible.
Exactly. So I really benefited a lot from COVID, I think, as well as causing delays. But if you remember that also around that time was Brexit, and the I-beams had been ordered from Germany due to mainly the company being much more helpful on structural engineering side of things than the alternative place there's one place in Scotland or Europe to get them from, and the builder had plumped for Europe for various reasons, which I was happy with at the time, but it meant they were very heavily delayed to ever turn up. So by the time they turned up, it was the middle of winter, so we couldn't actually even start work until the following spring. So there was a lot of stopping and starting. And then the actual structure went up quite fast, but then there was a lot of waiting around for other things to happen. We started with the infrastructure. We started by getting the access in, and that was done. It started in the middle of winter, and then they just couldn't get far enough. So that was one spring, and then it was the next spring before we actually started building. But I haven't been pushing it. I like having builders around. I enjoy the process. Not everything about it, obviously, but I have no particular need to speed this up.
What does that mean on a day-to-day basis? What sort of things can you take us through the last few months of what would you do on a typical day? Is a lot of your day still to do with this?
Yes, it certainly is. We had the air tightness done a month or so ago, so getting ready for that, making sure all the taping was complete. I left off taping the floor because I didn't want people trampling on it. So I did that, the day before they came, that sort of thing. And then after they came, I had to lay a load of protection down to protect the tape, so it's now not being damaged. So there's that kind of stuff. And then there's, on the design side, I'm working out details of the staircase at the moment. On the construction side, I'm going to go round and ensure that there's a lot of extra batten in place that I'm going to cut and put up before the plasterboard goes on, so as to make sure that I've got fixings everywhere I need them later on. So I've got a sort of long list of different aspects. There's a couple more outdoor things I want to do before the winter.
And what stage does it need to be at so that you are able to move in, and would you move in?
Interesting. Ideally, you don't move in till it's finished, because if you do move in, you'll never finish it. Moving in is going to be relatively straightforward because I've only got 50 metres to move. So I can.
So you think.
But I could move gradually. And I have this rather naive idea that what I'll do is I'll move in the things that I like from the old house to the new house, and then see how it looks, and not move more than I have to. And then I'll just dump everything else. But I don't think it'll work that way.
That sounds like the Marie Kondo, her way of sorting through. Well, I like that idea. Would that give you any advantage? What are your plans for this existing bungalow beside your property?
Originally, I thought I'd rent it out and live off the rent, but I think actually I'm going to have to sell it to help the budget. Yeah, I mean, it would have been nice if one of the kids wanted to live in it, but I don't think they do. I could be a granny in the garden, but I think that's probably a fantasy as well. So yeah, the property will be split. I will keep the workshop and a big bit of the garden. So.
Well, it'd be nice, almost a la Grand Designs, to catch up again, because I think, you've got a bit more in this, but what I love is the craft side, I think, starting to come out again. Is that a temptation as well? Because, I mean, you must be almost coming into your own element now.
Yes, at last I'm onto a bit that I know what I'm doing.
Exactly.
Well, I mean, I can build stud walls and stuff, I've done that. But yes, it's getting onto the more craftsmanship element. And I'm certainly, things like the staircase, I'm overcomplicating the kitchen, I'm overcomplicating, which is silly really, but it'll be, I need to be a bit more sensible, otherwise I'll never move in. But the kids think that it's not about living there at all. They think it's about making it. But I'll spin it out as long as possible.
Well, I've heard this as well. But
I think you might be right.
A lot of lovely craft going in. That's what you do.
Yeah. I mean,
is that what you still enjoy doing? Because you obviously retired from this, but you still get a kick out of it.
Yes, I think so. I mean, physically it's harder, and I don't have any employees to wave my arms out about and say, "Sand that, please." So it's harder work. But yeah, there will be a certain amount of that, and that will be fun.
So just a couple more questions before I finish up here. So where are we at today? What's the situation? Because a lot of the real work is actually behind you. To a point.
The trouble is, it looks like that at this stage, and you don't realise how much is ahead. I mean, what I'm doing at the moment is waiting for about 6 people to do different things. I need the plumber to come back and move a couple of pipes. I need the electrician to bring the last cables in. I need a little bit more wood chip to finish the paths in the garden, and the drainage system involves wood chip as well. There's at least 2 other people I'm waiting for to do things. But meanwhile, there's plenty for me to crack on with as well. I think the next big thing is plasterboarding and plastering.
And as you reflect on the project, is there anything that you would do differently, or anything that you've learned from going through this?
Oh, gosh. Yes, I think it'd be better on me to further down the slope. I'd shift it.
Oh, that's interesting. Why that one, though?
I think we're a little bit, and I know Dan said this at the time, so the corner of the property is too close to the boundary of the property. So you can swing a wheelbarrow around there, but, it feels a little bit constrained. I think I've had a really nice team of people. I've been very fortunate, but I might have lined up the team a little bit more in advance, because what I tended to do was wait until I was ready and look for an electrician. And obviously then good electricians and I've known that, and I'm still doing it, in that, I think, well, if I find a plasterer today and then I haven't done the battening and he happens to have time to make a start, then I'm not ready. So that side of scheduling,
that's
is perhaps
project management.
Project
isn't
management.
It? Yeah.
On purpose, I'm taking things one step at a time, because it gets very stressful if you're trying to manage 5 trades at once. And I know that's the proper way to do it.
But you're not just a project manager on this. What do you call yourself on this?
Well, yeah, I guess I'm much more hands-on than a project manager. And I think, I'm going to get the plasterers in, they can put the plasterboard up. But actually, then I realised that there's various things about the way I've splayed the windows and the way I want to work around the staircase and so forth, that perhaps it'd be better if I put the plasterboard up and I can get somebody in to give me a hand. So there's that element of... we didn't talk about the actual plasterboard. So I'm hoping, because it's supposed to be a low-carbon build, well, it is a low-carbon, low-impact build. And one of the biggest areas when you're working primarily with wood that you generally can't change unless you've got a very large budget is the plasterboard and the plaster, both of which involve gypsum, which are very carbon intensive. So Dan is currently working for a company which is making a low carbon alternative to plasterboard, but which performs just like plasterboard, and hopefully is within a similar sort of budget region. And the company also already make a lime-based plaster that goes on exactly the same as a gypsum plaster. So I'll certainly be able to use the plaster to reduce the carbon element there. The boarding, I think we're going to become a pilot project, at least in 1 or 2 rooms for the board, which is in its early stages of production, to see how it performs. In which case, yes, we'll be involved in putting it up as well.
Well, it's a fantastic house, and as I say, I would love to see the completed home whenever that might be. So, Lucinda, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Please come back. Give me another year, probably, and then reconvene on the balcony in the finished house.
Head online to take a look at the show notes that accompany this session. houseplanninghelp.com/367. We've got a summary for you. We've got lots of photos to look at so you can check out the project. If you've got a comment or you'd like to ask a question, either do that within the show notes. You'll have to head down to the bottom, or on social media. We'll give you some links. Once again, houseplanninghelp.com/367. My call to action is to check out the Hub. And this is the membership community that I run alongside House Planning Help, giving you further assistance so you can open the vault and head in, whether you want to watch one of our in-depth video case studies. In fact, behind the scenes, we're thinking whether we might be able to start another one soon. But what we do is we follow projects from start to finish, trying to draw out all the decisions that are being made so it'll help you ahead of your project. Or maybe you prefer to interact. You can do that in the forum with other self-builders who are all serious. That's why they're in here. Or maybe you want to speak to me during office hours, or ask the expert when we bring our experts on. That's the idea of this. It's just lots of either self-learning or interaction all in one place. houseplanninghelp.com/join. Next time we're talking ecology and landscapes with Toby Diggins. Thanks for listening. The House Planning Help podcast is produced by Regen Media, content that matters.